Good evening. My name is Sandra Pan. I'm a vice chair of the 1990 Institute. For over 3 decades, one of our dual missions has been to foster a balanced, objective understanding of China and its complex relationship with the United States. In a world defined by headlines about rivalry, friction, and technological competition, this mission isn't just relevant, it's absolutely crucial. Tonight, we stepped into the most critical frontier of this era, artificial intelligence. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our funder and co-sponsor for making this event possible. The rise of advanced AI is the defining global race of the 21st century. It's reshaping not just economies and national security, but of the very fabric how people learn, work, and create. This competition is massive. Just last year, the United States invested billions of dollars in AI investments. China, on the other hand, is dominating research and strategically aiming to be the global leader in innovation by 2030. This innovation frontier is the worry of every parent, the challenge of every government, and the curiosity of every youth. This is the essential of digital literacy today. But the real risk of AI are not just about who wins this global power competition. Fraud, deepfakes, and misinformation are a global threat that recognizes no borders. And recognizing this shared vulnerability may be one of the few areas that U.S. China can find common ground. Global relations are no longer binary. Every person, every machine is interconnected, and this influence is occurring at unimaginable speed and scale. Tonight, we're zeroing in on China's perspective and how they're engaging, how they're regulating, and the core question for us all is the ultimate solution of building higher guardrails, or is it simply a race to maximize speed and adoption? We're honored to have two distinguished speakers to guide us. Graham Webster, editor-in-chief of the China project at Stanford University, who will unpack China's national strategy for AI and trace that seismic shift in the U.S. China tech relationship from collaboration to fierce competition. And Ziyi Yang, senior writer for Wired magazine, will also bring essential human perspective, this vivid and on the ground stories of innovators and citizens in China who are living and working with the technology every single day. Following their talk, Clay Doby from U.S. China Institute will lead a discussion on how we can better understand and navigate this rapidly changing landscape. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. Here is our agenda for today. We will also conduct 3 polls this evening. Here is the first poll. How do you primarily view the rapid advancement of AI? Now, please welcome Graham Webster.
Hello, everybody. Uh, so, I want to just say a couple of words about who I am and how I come to this set of questions, because I find that's a helpful way to begin. So, as Sandra mentioned, I work at Stanford University, where I'm a research scholar and a lecturer. Primarily, I run a program called China, where we study Chinese tech policy and the implications that it might have for U.S. China relations in the outside world. We try to bring Chinese language materials into English, both in terms of translation and with context to make it understandable. And I also conduct direct scholarly engagements and dialogues with Chinese scholars on developing policy issues in tech. So, really for the last 10 years or so, I've been focused on tech and U.S. China relations, and I began this journey as a student studying how Chinese people were using early internet technologies to mobilize in 20 years ago when there were protests against Japan in Beijing and other cities in China. So I'm not not a real academic. I'm not a real normal journalist, and I'm not a normal kind of policy person. But instead, I've ended up uh, being some of each of these things. So that just that to provide that context on what type of person is going to share these ideas. So to think about how we ought to understand uh, AI, national strategy, uh, in U.S. China relations and in China on its own, I think the best place to start is to zoom out a little bit and to think about how internet technology has played into U.S. China relations over the last 25 years or so. Um, we've arrived at this location at this part of history today where um, we hear a lot about there being a tech competition. Basically that the United States and China are in a race or in a competition to dominate in technology. We hear about an AI race, and I'll talk a little bit about that idea a little bit more later. We have all these sort of news events where in the Biden administration put really substantial controls on uh, microchips and semiconductors that are most useful for AI development, restricting those from being exported to China and trying to undermine China's own developments. We have China, it's sort of in reply, uh, both threatening to and sometimes actually clamping down on rare earth supply chains. Um, you have a whole set of questions about autocracy versus democracy. You have, the idea of a surveillance state in China and questions about whether the United States might be following in that path. And there's just a lot of discussion about how the last 25, 30 years of US China economic integration might be reaching a period of decoupling. But I don't think we can understand decoupling and all of these sort of conflicts without laying a groundwork for how we got here. So I'm going to do that quickly, and then I'm going to try to talk a bit about the way China's government has thought about AI development and regulation over the last few years. I think Ziyi will talk a little bit more about uh, some of the aspects of the actual AI models and stuff that are being developed and the way that that the industry is working these days. So I want to rewind 25 years, actually more like 25 and a half, to the year 2000. It's the Bill Clinton administration. And after a great deal of debate and reversing some political stances, the Clinton administration decided that it was going to try to work with China to bring China into the World Trade Organization, then a relatively new entity, and really this sort of um, international infrastructure behind what was then the big buzzword at the time. I was in high school, but the big buzzword at the time was globalization, and what was this going to mean in the post-Cold War era and the expansion of capitalism and markets around the world. The Clinton administration was working to bring China in and making a deal so that China could enter the World Trade Organization. And President Clinton had to convince the U.S. Congress to basically vote to approve this without going into the technicalities. The Congress had a veto on this. They had to approve uh, most favored nation status and permanent normal trade relations with China. Um, and in trying to make this case, Clinton made a number of speeches, but one became very famous for those of us who are uh, who study the Chinese internet. Uh, the the famous thing that he said is that trying to control the internet is like nailing Jello to the wall. He says, "Good luck," and he points out that China has, tried to begin to crack down on the internet, but he just doesn't think it's going to work, and he describes the way that you could imagine how much the United States had already changed with the internet, and China was sure to follow. And there was a lot of discussion at the time also about how markets would change China. And the undercurrent of this was technology could just produce freedom. It might be the natural outcome of the internet as a protocol and has a set of technologies to produce freedom, just like markets might produce freedom. And people had all kinds of different ideas about how that would happen. Well, of course, it became quickly a cliche that China had successfully nailed Jello to the wall. And those of us who were uh, lucky enough to experience the internet in China in the early aughts experienced the progression of increasing numbers of of censorship technologies, things that blocked the access from Chinese users going to international websites, as well as ways in which systems were built to monitor and and manipulate, what people could say and see online within China. So, you know, there's this original dream, and I think we just hold this thought of technology would produce a social change. Uh, and it turned out that wasn't what happened. What happened instead was that the authoritarian uh, character of China's system adapted the internet's technical machinery to its own needs, and those needs were to move forward in development in a high tech realm and keep pace and try to continue developing something that had been a major Chinese priority since the late 1970s. And at the same time to maintain the leadership and the control of the Chinese Communist Party and the party state system. So that's, they managed to do it. And what happened with the WTO is that trade and investment between the United States and China and many other countries became a lot easier. And that period of market globalization did advance. And moving forward a little, I'm going to kind of scoot forward in time pretty quickly now. But from that moment of a dream of democracy coming from the end of a fiber optic cable, you end up in a time where actually the social and political systems remain very, very different, even as United States and China both have their own fairly rapid economic and social transformations with the internet. I think there's a big milestone that comes a few years later, around 2007. That's when they released the iPhone. I think 2007 was the first one. It's right around there. Um, and the iPhone popularized mobile access to the internet beyond the most laborious kind of ways of typing, and really started to change what could be done in commerce, what could be done socially. It meant that many people very rapidly began to have on their person a decent little camera that could send things online immediately, a little video camera. There was just an explosion in the ability to create information and to interact in the service economy. This was a U.S. Chinese joint production. Apple could not have produced the iPhone without Chinese supply chains and manufacturing. China could not have produced the extraordinarily rapid development of its digital economy and rapid delivery and all kinds of other, gig work type of economic changes that have truly transformed Chinese cities without this original U.S. Chinese conjuncture in the smartphone era. And significantly, a lot of Americans and a lot of Chinese made a lot of money this way. It was hugely, Apple for a very long time now has made a huge amount of money off of iPhones that have relied on the Chinese supply chain and significantly also on the Chinese market at various times. Um, Chinese companies in manufacturers as well as service industry companies have really leveraged this technology, not just Apple's products, but the entire kind of smartphone connected mobile internet era. And that seemed all well and good. And there was, I think you get a bit of a golden era there where US Chinese relations on technology where it was seen as a bright point because important people were making lots of money, I think, really, and it wasn't creating a lot of trouble points. Of course, the two countries were never best of friends, but tech wasn't the driver of their difficulties. They had other longstanding issues to work through. This begins to change in uh, you know, I sort of mark it as 2015, but you can look at the period between maybe 2012 and 2015 as a turning point. At that point, you have a few things that happen. There's Edward Snowden's revelations about U.S. spying online. Absolutely had a huge impact around the world and definitely in China about uh, could we trust each other uh, using the internet together. You had the elevation of Xi Jinping to be the lead or the head of the Chinese Communist Party and the head of the Chinese state, and the gradual realization that his style of governance would be increasingly repressive. This coincided with some crackdowns on the internet in China. And you also had, increasing U.S. concerns about human rights and other, or sorry, not, I mean, human rights was one, but what I was going to say was uh, intellectual property theft. Um, and the sense that Americans could make tons of money doing business in digital China was coming under challenge. So I argue that this is so we're in 10 years ago, and we didn't know who was going to be president beginning in 2017. But even if Hillary Clinton had won and had become president in 2017, uh, we were going to see changes. And the backdrop to these changes really comes in a mutual sense of insecurity that I believe was built on top of the fact that there are that increasing parts of society were relying on digital technologies and networks, and that the supply chains, both software, hardware, and the connectivity, made uh, both countries feel vulnerable to one another because of the way that we rely on those technologies. The vulnerabilities I and the sense of insecurity are what leads to the idea of a potential decoupling. And it comes from the idea that uh, because we rely on one another for our tech supply chains, and because online systems might be vulnerable to attack, uh, there are concerns about espionage, right? The Snowden revelations made this very clear. One of the things that really stood out for Chinese observers was that it was revealed that the United States sometimes would intercept hardware and put a listening device in before it went onward, it got shipped onward to countries where the United States wanted to monitor things. There was a concern about sabotage. So very connected to the idea of if you are relying on a company that lives in a country where you have a rival government, maybe that government could lean on engineers or people in the back end of some system uh, to put in a vulnerability, and maybe that could cause trouble in time of conflict or some sort of all kinds of different imaginations about what we might do to each other. Um, and then there's those are pretty easy to understand. The logic for decoupling or sort of reduced reliance becomes very obvious when you realize that some things, yeah, like for instance, it's very easy to understand that it doesn't make sense too much to have the Pentagon relying on Chinese IT systems, especially if they're going to be connected to the internet because maybe somebody on the Chinese side might try to slip something in there. Just easy logic, and it goes exactly the same in the other direction. Some things are so important, you don't want to be vulnerable to the other. But then it snowballs. Um, and so you start to think, well, okay, well, maybe my personal information is vulnerable, and maybe my corporate information is vulnerable. And, what should we be concerned about? You get an increase of insecurity and people don't know what they can rely on and what they can't. There's a few more reasons for thinking about decoupling. I'll mention briefly and then go into the heavy AI stuff. But um, it's also dependence. The other side might be able to pull your supply chains away at times of conflict, and that's something that the first the Trump administration and then further history has demonstrated that these governments are willing to do to each other. There's governance disagreements. Do these technologies that we buy from each other embed political norms? Are the American technologies not properly censored? Are the Chinese technologies including some political bias that we're concerned about? You hear about that in the kind of TikTok conversation. Um, and then there's, basic profit and advantage. Um, can my industry gain from this technological change? Can my investors take home the money? Or will that benefit be held by the dominant platforms in another country? And that's a logic of recrimination that is really taking hold around the world. All of that applied before AI was a big deal, but all of it applies to the AI world now. Espionage, sabotage, dependence, governance, profit advantage, all of these things are at stake. And the question is, how far apart, how far should these economies pull apart? And at what cost? Is there a balance to be struck? Okay, I'm going to shift to the AI strategy as the Chinese government seems to look at it. And then I'll try to close in a few minutes on the where this decoupling and mutual insecurity logic seems to impact things in this AI era. I'm obligated to say that when we're talking about AI, we have to be modest and either precise. We either have to be very precise about what we mean or be clear that we're not being specific. AI doesn't mean anything in specific. It isn't just chatbots. It isn't just facial recognition. It's many different things. And we always have to be sensitive to that. AI in general doesn't say anything. But there's a question about whether the Chinese government sees itself as in a race with the United States for AI. And I want to talk about some signs that it does and some signs that it doesn't, and then some reasons that I think that this is not a very good question. um, the Some reasons that you might think the Chinese government sees itself as in a race with the United States in artificial intelligence come from government documents that have been published and that urge Chinese companies and local governments and other organizations to push development forward and to reach world-leading status in artificial intelligence. Specifically, in 2017, the State Council, which is the government part of the Chinese system as opposed to the party part, published what was called a new generation artificial intelligence development plan. And this plan had a lot of lofty ideas and identified a lot of different ideas about what AI might be useful for, as well as some risks. And it did seem to have this competitive aspect. It had a vision for China to be a leader. It didn't say who it wanted to beat, but the context of technological leadership to be at the world leading level, no one would say that you weren't talking about at least the United States, if not others, at the same time. Then there are aspects where you'd say the Chinese government really doesn't seem to be thinking about a race in artificial intelligence. And here, we can't know for sure. But there is in present day discussions about what AI is, you have a lot of conversations about quite fuzzy concepts like artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. These are ideas that have been that are where there are no agreed definitions. You can't possibly know whether the thing has been achieved or not. But that some people say we, a country, or we, a company, or we, a set of researchers, ought to move forward and get to this place first. Artificial general intelligence, superintelligence, whatever. Um, you know, the way that China's system, both in terms of industry and government, as well as sort of academic AI and machine learning experts have looked at it, this has not been a major fixation until recently, and it's still not as big of a deal in Chinese discourse as it is in the United States. It's something we hear all the time uh, in my neighborhood here. commuting between Oakland and Stanford. Uh, there's just a lot of consciousness here of let's race to this big moment, and maybe we ought to beat China there. And policies in the Biden administration seem to embody that idea as at least part of what motivated their efforts to hold China back with using microchips. But the Chinese goals are a little more modest. Let's develop. Let's move forward. Let's keep pace with the cutting edge. But they don't necessarily have this sense of a goal, and so that's why I think it can be just to be a bit provocative. It can be basically a bad idea to think about a race in artificial intelligence. And I'll say a few more things about why I think there's trouble there. One is if you have a race, um, there ought to be a finish line, right? And so there you have these quite controversial and not very well defined ideas about artificial general intelligence or superintelligence. That's some people's ideal finish lines. Um, you might have a specific one. You might say, uh, I want to race to develop for my company to develop a fully autonomous car that can drive with, on any road and safely navigate without a human driver. Okay, that's a definable race. You could also talk about racing to reach some particular specific technology that you believe would lead to some military advantage. Um, but if you talk about an AI race without specifying some goal, you're just not talking about anything in specific. And a lot of the time you can't nail down people who want to win the AI race on what it is they're racing toward. Another problem with the AI race, in my opinion, is that uh, this concept sort of collapses companies or technologies with nations. So I've ridden in a Waymo car. I've driven by many of them here in the Bay Area. These are highly autonomous vehicles, and they're doing really well. Um, has the United States won the race to autonomous driving, or has Alphabet and Waymo and the larger kind of Google ecosystem won this little battle? I'm not sure. You could say, obviously, this is a California-based company, and it's not based in Beijing or Shenzhen, but it's you know the question of who wins is pretty muddled, and I don't think it's the right way to think for us to collapse the idea of a nation and the individual technologies that are developed. Um, so that will also apply if there is something like an AGI finish line that people have theorized. If OpenAI reaches some uh, mind-blowing threshold, has the United States won or has OpenAI won? Right? Same thing for Alibaba or some other Chinese company. Okay, so I'm out of time here. I'm gonna save any other comments for our discussion. There's so much to get to, but I just wanted to open with those ideas, and so to kind of reiterate, the key thing here is that U.S. China relations and technology has been through a kind of winding path where there was an idea in the beginning that uh, markets and the internet might change China, and some people who thought that turned out to be quite disappointed. But the U.S. and China figured out ways to work happily together for quite some years under certain tech paradigms. But then both of our societies became so much more dependent on and more widely using internet and connected technologies that we started to feel insecure with one another. And I believe that led to the setting in of uh, this sense of insecurity and also then a sense of competition and a desire to separate and perhaps dominate one another. That dynamic is something that's untold, and you hear people today talking about dreams of what the technology might do. Um, I'd just leave you with the idea that maybe we should be modest about what we expect from AI, whatever that means in specific, going forward. So I'll end there. Looking forward to the other remarks.
Thank you, Graham, for this comprehensive presentation. Here is the second poll. Which area of digital literacy is most challenging to address in the U.S. China AI race? Thank you. We would like to bring up next would be for Ziyi Yang to give us a on-the-ground perspective of how AI is impacting China.
Thank you, Sandra. And thank you, Graham, for really well recapturing and also resetting the perspective we have to view the US-China relations around AI. I'm gonna share my slides about my part of the presentation. Can everyone see this? Okay,
Yes, we're
perfect.
good.
Yeah. So my presentation will focus more on the reality side of what AI is in China, because that's where I grew up, that's where I watch very closely in my job. And also just a bit about that, I am a senior writer at Wired, the technology magazine, and I focus on Chinese tech companies and tech trends. So really, this is the kind of the four topics I want to get into today. Is really about kind of understanding what the AI landscape, what the AI sector, what the AI apps look like in China, and try to compare them a little bit with the American companies and the tools that we're really familiar with here. And then I want to focus more on the applications in education. First, on K to 12 education, especially there's a very interesting application that we're seeing a lot on Chinese internet, and then moving more on to higher education about how AI talents is trained in China and also are attracted, the government hopes to attract it to China. Starting with the first chapter, I would like to ask everyone, the audience, to know, maybe share in the chat or just like say to yourself, like what is the AI tool that you use the most on a daily basis? Is it ChatGPT? Is it Google Gemini, which just released a really advanced model this week, or is it some of the more newcomers like Grok? But whatever the answer you have, likely they are not available in China, because really most of the advanced or the common AI models we know are not accessible in China. First of all, because they are censored. Their websites are not available. Their apps are not even, they're removed from the app stores. So if you are just like a random Chinese person in China, very hard for you to actually find those apps just like on the internet. But at the same time, we also need to know that this is a decision made deliberately by the American or Western AI companies too. Some of the prime examples, including OpenAI and Anthropic, they deliberately restrict people based in China or using Chinese IPs to use their services. Like Anthropic has actually resolved to call China the adversarial nation that they do not want to do business with. So in two ways, most Chinese people are blocked from using the Western AI tools we know. It does not mean that they just cannot access them at all. You can if you are technologically savvy enough. First of all, you would definitely have to have a VPN service to make you connect to the global world that's outside China's Great Firewall. But at the same time, to use a Western AI tool, usually you need more than that. You would need like an email address, a foreign phone number, a app store account, and if you want to better the premium versions of it, you have a credit card for that too. So really all of that is to say that when we are talking about the realities of AI applications in China, it's gonna look so different from people are used to here in the US. So what are they actually using there? Here's like a very non-exhaustive list of the biggest companies and apps that are being used in China. And I divided them into two camps. The first of all are the tech giants in China. These are names like Alibaba and Tencent and ByteDance and Huawei and Baidu that even if you're not familiar with Chinese tech, you probably have heard of them. All of the Chinese tech companies have jumped into this race to develop their own foundational large language models and myriad applications of it. Some of this, like Ernie was probably the first Chinese model that was introduced to kind of rival OpenAI. But right now it's really about the ByteDance AI app Doubao or Alibaba's open source model Qwen that is more kind of like at the forefront of people's attention. At the same time, there are a lot of tech startups. When I say tech startups, these are companies that kind of emerged in the last decade. They really has this one mission of developing a good foundational model. So this is where we can see DeepSeek, which is obviously needs no introduction at this point, but also other names like Zhipu and Minimax and Moonshot, which are really like the hotshots in China, in the Chinese AI tech scene, as the companies that have much less resources than the first row, but also are making pretty capable products. And I want to just mention too, like there are some AI startups from the last generation when back to the years when if we're talking about AI, we're talking about computer vision and facial recognition. And the companies like SenseTime and iFi Tech, they also pivoted to making the large language models too. And they are still part of the competition, but they're probably less kind of popular in the public narrative at this point. And if you're looking at kind of like which of these apps are actually popular in China, I I think you're probably gonna be surprised because if you really ask anyone in the US what's one Chinese AI app they might know, it's probably DeepSeek. But in the last 2 months, I think this data ends in September, but it's starting in August. Is no longer the most popular AI app in China. Doubao, developed by Baiden's, has taken the first spot. And this is the data of this is from a Chinese mobile app intelligence company called Quest Mobile. And I wrote about this last month. Really, the interesting here is that we're not very surprised about this because Biden is really known for making very good apps. Like even though they're not the first company to work on AI, they're probably not the best company who has AI research, but they're really good at making it a usable app that attract every single user and give them like a taste of AI for their own kind of consumption habit. So Biden has seemingly used that to their advantage to make their AI app kind of the most popular or the one used by over 172 million people in China at this point. The other thing I want to point out about this list, the top 10 kind of most used AI apps in China, is that most of the apps you see here are like very general models. Like you can ask them any question, you can ask them to generate any kind of picture. They're not designed for specific purposes, except for two. There's two here, one by Biden's and one by startups that I will mention later. They're just designed specifically for education purposes. And really, I'm going to elaborate more on that. They're really just designed for students to answer their to use AI to answer their homework. And that's like one of the most interesting applications that I see for to use AI in education in China. One last thing to mention there. This list of top 10, again, is pretty much dominated by big techs. You see one, two, three apps developed by Baiden's. You see two by Alibaba, one by Baidu, one by Tencent. That again tells you that this is a landscape mostly dominated by uh, companies with deep pockets. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we often talk about, oh, there's this race. We can also look at this too, like whether there's a race between the US and China. One way to look at this is that if we do measure the model's capabilities, what we're seeing is that the Chinese models are catching up compared to what they were 2 or 3 years ago in AI. This is a number published in the 2025 AI Index report by the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, but it cites ALM Arena. They really just like puts like test the capabilities of different large language models and see how capable they are and give them a score. What they have observed is that in the past year, the gap between the most capable US large language model and the most capable Chinese model is just like narrowing. It's still the China has not overcome the US models yet, but they're narrowing. And if this trend continues, we can see at a point that maybe the Chinese models will be, at least in some respect, better, more capable than the US models of their peers. So moving on to the next chapter, I wanted to talk a little bit about, so after seeing what's the landscape in China now, how do we observe the differences between these Chinese AI companies and the US AI companies? I think these are kind of like four differences I just summarize here, but there are obviously a lot of them more. Going one by one, the American AI companies are often focused more on enterprise platforms. We're talking about kind of platforms made for companies to purchase lots of compute, to purchase lots of their like value-added services. Whereas the Chinese AI companies, like the apps we just saw, are really pushed more towards consumers. They're to push to like everyday normal people, get them to use more AI and maybe pay for AI. And then the other difference is that, which I will go elaborate more in the next slide, is that a lot of the American AI companies are developing closed source models, which means that these are models that you can only use, but you cannot modify them. You cannot kind of try to understand how the model works because they really put that behind into like a black box. Whereas Chinese companies are a lot more active in the open source world, especially here we mean open weight models. So they're releasing models that other developers who wants to like fine tune the models, who want to change the model for their own like customized purposes can and are able to do that through the open source releases. Another thing we just mentioned, well, in the China, is really the big tech companies, they're dominating the field right now. But in the US, we're seeing companies like OpenAI and Anthropic really quickly becoming uh, are valued at hundreds of billions of dollars or even trillions. So this is in the US, the field is actually a lot more disruptive, and we are seeing more startups kind of coming into the scene. Whereas in China, the startups really are still at the second kind of like are not the frontline players right now. The last thing, which is really a very philosophical question here, is that we see in the US a lot of the companies, the startups, really like to talk about how they want to achieve AGI, how all of their work, no matter whether it's consumer facing or enterprise facing, is preparing for the moment that they achieve AGI. But you're going to see a lot less of that in China. With the caveat being that DeepSeek is actually pretty dedicated to AGI research, but most of the other companies are a lot more realistic. They're like, we are trying to find out how can we use AI in different use cases, in different applications, in different sectors. That's what we call the diffusion of AI models. But also like how to make money from it, really starting with a normal consumer or a small enterprise user. So those are the four kind of differences I think people can should understand about the divergent trends between U.S. and Chinese industries. Here under here is like a quote from Substack that I read recently, really again about kind of like how when the Chinese company approach their AI models, they approach it a little differently from the Americans one here. Um, and as I said, I was going to elaborate more on the closed source and open source difference. This is a really good example. So Hugging Face is a kind of an online forum for AI developer communities to come to meet each other, to discuss like what they're doing with their AI models and try to kind of like learn from each other's models. So this really is a great community for people to share their work and also kind of like publish their open source models for other people to tinker with. And if you're looking at the Hugging Face kind of leaderboard, or like the models that most people are interested in or trending right now, most of them are based on Chinese models. This is just a screenshot I made today, kind of like the hottest models on Hugging Face right now, and 8 of the top 10 are either released by Chinese companies or adapted, fine-tuned from a Chinese model. And that just tells you that if you are someone who are deep in the field of like researching open source models or using open source model either for academic or commercial work, then it's really hard to not use a Chinese model at this point. And then other few things I wanted to mention is that these are not really I guess, the most notable things that when people are talking about when they're talking about Chinese AI, but there's still a lot of Chinese AI companies working on other stuff too. Like one of the hottest field this year is humanoid robots, right? And this connection to AI is really how can companies develop AI models that make the robots adapt to all kinds of natural environments, and like can walk without guidance, can dance, can play stunts, can run, and that's what they call embodied AI. Another area Chinese companies are working really hard on is autonomous driving. And I would say that that is partly because China also has this really big lead in electric vehicles that enabled a lot of Chinese electric vehicle startups to focus on, can we make our products smarter? Can we incorporate AI into the driving experience? So what you're going to see is that if you are buying a car in China, you're going to see a lot of the car companies offering more autonomous driving features as part of the package they're selling to you with their car. And it's actually pretty affordable there. The third thing, which I find really specific, and I haven't seen any other country really follow up with, is that a lot of Chinese companies are working on the use of very affordable deepfake avatars. So we're talking about like replicating your look and then using it for some purpose, for commercial purposes. And this again kind of builds upon China's other advantage in live streaming e-commerce industry, which is a gigantic industry creating a lot of value in China every year. The last thing I want to mention, also bringing back to the discussion about sense time and eye-flight tech, is that there are still a lot of Chinese companies working on the traditional sectors of AI, like computer vision, like surveillance cameras. If you are going out to buy a pet monitor or a baby monitor camera at this point, chances are a lot of them are still made by Chinese companies and Chinese technologies because they represent kind of the front line of surveillance technology. So even though those are not the hottest topics anymore, a lot of companies are still working on and producing those technologies. This is again another small case study of how when we're talking about the commercial applications of deepfake avatars, what they can be. And it's really interesting because I got to write about two use cases, like in 2023 and 2024. Um, the technology behind them is really the same. Like you feed a few photos or video into a language model, into a video model, and they learn the likeness of your facial features and your body, and they try to create an avatar that can move according to directions and that can kind of like voice the text that you feed it. And Chinese companies have figured out actually there are commercial uses for us to make money with this technology. One of them is to use it to create artificial streamers that can just like stream 24/7 to sell you random products on Taobao. The background is that like actual human streamers that do e-commerce shopping sales are already a really big business in China. But they cannot work 24 hours. They have to rest. They have to go to bed. But then, shoppers come to the website all the time. I might wake up at 3 a.m. and want to buy something, and I would love to ask someone a question about how does this product work? So what some companies figure out is that actually let's train an avatar. It's not that advanced, but it's good enough that some audience just seeing that at midnight will believe it's true and they will ask a question. And our large language models will understand that question and feed our answer. And they feel like they're still being serviced, even though it's like the wee hours of the day. So this is one area that they find use it, and actually has been adopted a lot by the sellers on e-commerce websites in China. Another one, which is really more about the cultural use of AI, is that they're also using these digital avatars as a way to grieve and to talk to your loved ones that has passed away. So this will mostly like children who create like digital avatars of their parents who passed away and kind of like try to hold on to them, to talk to them, to ask them questions. Some of them will feed their parents' life stories into the model so that the models would know a little bit about who this person is and like try to act that way. And again, this is like kind of like surprisingly successful product that I haven't really seen in other cultures. But it proved that there's a profit to be made there. And moving on to the third chapter, I do want to talk about there's this really we are seeing a boom of AI tutoring apps in China. We just look at like the top 10 AI apps in China. I was actually surprised to know that two of them are specific for education and not other like specific use cases. And I, but if you really ask people who have been observing this space about why China has such dedication to the field of AI tutoring apps, it's not that surprising because it really combines two industries that have been very popular and very lucrative in China into this AI tutoring space. We're talking about first the AI diffusion, which is this idea that Chinese companies are trying to make to apply AI into every single use case and see if they stick there. And also the tutoring app that has been kind of blooming in the past decade and making a lot of money. So combine that with the AI craze, the fact that everyone wants to get on AI now, you get a lot of AI tutoring apps. They're trying to use the best models that they may not have developed themselves, but to use them in kind of like creating lessons, to creating specialized tutoring, and to help students understand their homework questions. Here's another case study that I think is one of the most prominent examples of this homework help tutoring apps with AI in China. So 作业帮 as a startup was founded in 2015, and the name literally just translates to homework help, and that was exactly what it was doing in the beginning. Is that if you are a student, I think it's mostly talking about middle school, high school, less about higher education, that you would like encounter a question that you don't understand in your homework or test. And then you take a picture of that, you will upload it to the app, and the app will try to identify in its database of questions that what is this question, how can you solve it, and try to either give you a straightforward answer or educate you about how to solve this problem. This is the idea of it. The thing that fascinates me is that this is really a demand that's pretty specific to China, it's because how heavily the education system in China is focused on exams and answering questions. As someone who grew up in the system, I knew that you have to do like one exam every, I think maybe twice a week or even more. So it's like you're always, and then homework every day too. So you're always facing a lot of questions that you probably don't understand, and you're going to be working on them after school, like when your teacher is not available and maybe your parents are not available too. So other than just thinking by yourself, I would appreciate some help in trying to educate me or tutor me in those hours too. And this is where a lot of startups in China, including Zoyabang, see an opportunity for itself. It's just that, okay, Chinese students needs to figure out so many questions. Let's help them, and there's some money to be made there. That is why the OG Zoyebang app today still has over 98 million monthly active users, which is really a lot of people and a very big business potential there. But what we have seen in the past 3 years is that they have adapted to AI age too. They have created apps. They're specifically about using AI in their original model of solving homework questions. So that's when they released like Kuaidu AI, which is a Chinese market-facing AI app that has about 6 million monthly active users now. They also have an international version, questions.ai, that anyone can use here in the United States. And this is also having about 6 million active users right now. But my understanding is that it used to have more, but has kind of been going on a decline in the past year. Um, if we focus on what this AI app really offers, here's a description I got from the App Store, like kind of the app describing itself, like what it offers. It's really, first of all, uh, helping the students to self-study, to see a question and understand how to solve the question. But also, it is marketed towards parents too, and by the chance are more likely to pay for services, for because they will need to tutor their the children too. So this app will equip them with the knowledge of like, okay, if you don't remember how middle school math works anymore, I can tell you how to do that. So that's one of the use case. Another thing it wants to focus on English learning because I think it makes sense. Language models are good at language, good at translation. So this is actually one of the use cases that makes more sense that helps someone in China learn English without being in an English environment. And then there's some like I guess more really like user-friendly innovations there is that other than just like identifying a question and helping you answer the question, it can help you track like what mistakes you've made in the past. Is there a pattern in what you don't understand? Or if you are preparing for a specific exam, is there something the app can do with AI's help to prepare for that? Um, and one thing I wanted to get to also maybe just briefly mention here is that there's a background to this AI apps because it's not a kind of a linear development. There has been a setback period for the AI tutoring industry because between 2021 and 2024, China entered like a tech crackdown era. When we talk crackdown, it's not to every single industry, but during the time there was a much stricter and more hostile attitude really from the Chinese government towards consumer tech industry in China, and they're limiting them in how profitable they can be. They're trying to get them to take on more social responsibility. Around the same time, the Chinese government also decided to target the tutoring and after-school education uh, industry, and to limit the ability they can offer tutoring to Chinese students. So combine that with the two, you are seeing that before 2020, there has been a big boom of education apps, including Zoyabang that we just saw, where a lot of the apps become really successful with a lot of users, but then sort of went on decline during the 4 years between 2020 and 2024 to just like into a survival mode, to go through this like intense crackdown on what they were allowed to do in China. But after 2025, when the Chinese government started kind of like pivoting back to focusing on AI, investing in AI, and creating an environment that encourages the AI industries to grow, they see the opportunity to come back in the field and kind of like reposition themselves as an innovative use of AI for the Chinese people. Um, One question I will ask to lots of people is that, do you consider this kind of app really a homework help app, or is it like a cheating aid? Because one of the very interest to me, it can really be both, and the line between them is very thin. And I find really one interesting example is that during the Gaokao, which is the national entrance exam, the most extreme and demanding exam in China every year, this year, the Chinese government actually asked all AI chatbots to stop some functions that could help people cheat in exam. They're basically asking them that if students are taking picture of a test and showing it to you, don't answer the questions because there is a chance they might be using it to cheat at a Gaokao. So just don't help them with that. I think of that as a very blunt force measure to work on a very difficult question to distinguish whether these apps are helping homework, helping cheating. But I think that would be a very good question for people to discuss. A few other things, and we can come back to this in the question in the Q&A. It's just that there are a lot of other ways that AI are being used in China. They're being used to evaluate teachers like their own teaching experience. They're being used to evaluate how students are paying attention in their classes, and they're being used in kind of creating devices and toys for really young children to learn. Um, I'll go through this very fast in the last section. It's just really about kind of like the AI talent pipeline. And a lot of times it is going from China to the US. This is a study from 2022, studying kind of really the world's top 20% AI researchers based on one top conference about AI. And what the Marco Polo Institute found is that 47% of the world's top AI researchers come from China, where only 18% come from the US. But in the end, after their grad school, after they started working, 42% of them ended up working in the US, which is the blue part on this graph. So we are seeing the trend that at this stage in the AI industry, a lot of talents come from China's undergrad, who had undergrad training in China, but ended up working in US academia in all the industry anyway. And that is a trend that really benefits the US a lot. Another example is that this year when Mark Zuckerberg was hiring for its like high profile push of new AI branch, of the 11 people they're receiving super high salaries at Meta right now, some of them are from China and receive undergrad education from China, which is another anecdote to tell you that how many Chinese talents are in the AI industry today. But we are seeing the kind of like the trend that benefits the US slowly being kind of like eliminated because of a lot of the policy of the current administration. We are seeing kind of visa restrictions that really kind of make it hard for people to stay in the US, companies to work. But we're also seeing a lot of the attacks on the academic front. We're seeing kind of like the funding withdrawal. We're also seeing very specific bans, I believe, in Florida that do not just not allow Chinese nationals or Chinese or people of Chinese origins to work in public universities. And also, sorry, go back. And also like the China initiative, which is supposed to have ended a few years ago, but with the new current administration, we are talking about whether it could be revived, whether it could be another way to deter Chinese academics from staying here. On the other hand, China's definitely hoping to take that as an opportunity to get talents to come to China. But could they do that? I'm really not that sure because unlike the US, we traditionally had a lot of ways for people to immigrate here, China doesn't, and is trying to figure out can they introduce more visa programs, other things to provide pathways for people for AI talents to come to China. A visa that just went into use this year is one example of that. We are still waiting to see how well that goes. But at the same time, there are a lot of other barriers too. Like for international talents, it's hard to integrate into the Chinese university. And it is hard to go into an ecosystem that is so divorced from the internet outside of China to the point you feel like it will be hard to connect back to your original research or tech communities. And in the end, we have to face the reality that there is very stringent censorship, even in academia in China too. Would those AI talents want to be in that kind of environment? Do they work? We're not sure. So I think there's a lot of work for China to do to really kind of like even talk about surpassing US in this field. So yeah, that's really all about my presentation. I know I dragged on a little bit, but hopefully not for too long. Would love to answer more questions later.
Thank you, Ziyi. Here is the last poll of the day. Which factor is the most crucial notion to win this race for AI leadership? Now welcome our moderator and our two speakers back to the screen for a conversation and also to answer some of your questions.
And thank you, Sandra. Thanks very much to the 1990 Institute for bringing this very timely webinar into being. And it's been a pleasure listening to Graham and Tsui and learning from their presentations. We have some questions that have come in from the audience, both at the time of registration and also that have been submitted either in the Q&A forum or in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of those as is possible, as makes sense, and I'll group many of them together. But my first question, I'd actually like to begin where Graham went, and then tie that together with where Zui was ended. And that's this question of rivalry, this question of race. Is there a race for this? And of course, the assumption is if you're talking about a race, as Graham suggested, shouldn't there be a finish line? Shouldn't there be some sort of destination? How are you measuring progress towards that? So he gave us some statistics about how these different large language models measure up on certain, a certain kind of test. But also, I share the hesitation Graham has with this idea because it suggests this is a zero sum enterprise that only one can win. And we've seen such a diversity of applications and approaches. And so perhaps this whole discussion that frames it as a two economic superpowers contending for the commanding heights of artificial intelligence. And maybe we've missed the bigger story here. And the bigger story is that what this technology means for us as humans first, rather than us as residents in one country or another. And how you have a lot of difficulty kind of determining what's Chinese, what's American in this equation. They're all running on machines with components from different places. The creators of these models come from different places. And as Zui suggested, there's just constant back and forth. Everybody in this field in China is paying attention to everybody in this field in the United States. And there is direct communication, but also, people just looking at what others are doing. And so my question, to the extent that it's a question rather than just a topic, is, for you both, have we been thinking about this all wrong from the start? And when I say we, I'm not talking about the people, you two or others, but is the standard framing of this a problem? Graham, you got us started on this as a problem. Sure. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, well, clearly, I think it's a problem. There's the way that I look at this, and I think it's really important when working with students. In my experience teaching on U.S. China relations, people come in with varying backgrounds in my small, annual seminar, but everybody has consumed media narratives and political leadership narratives often from both countries. The AI stuff has been, I think, particularly hard for people to evaluate. Even I'm teaching mostly master's students, and so these are folks who are pretty deep in some topic, and trying to do a careful job thinking it through. But the problem with talking about winning in AI is that you don't know what the future of the technology is. And it's important in my view, to be modest about what the future of the technology is, just as we should be modest in the year 2000 about what the future of internet and society will be, because we just don't know yet. But the answer, I think, to whether there is, something to dominate in or not, is a real one, and it sort of depends on that unknowable future. There are people who believe that there is a critical moment coming in the development of artificial intelligence systems that if you as a company get there first, you might build a machine that builds on itself and accelerates development in such a way that no one will ever be able to catch up. This is a concept that is sometimes called decisive strategic advantage or durable strategic advantage. I always mix those two up. Um, so if that's true, which it might be, then and if the technology is developed in a way that a nation can harness it, whatever that means, then it really does make sense to, if you're a U.S. planner, you'd rather that this happen in the United States first. And if you're a Chinese planner, you'd rather it happen in China first. But there's no guarantee that that's true. So in the many other pathways where the future of the technology is some other type of development, there are different types of competition. And so I think we just have to be specific. And I'm always careful to say that it makes sense to talk about uh, competition or a lead in certain types of the technology. If it has to do with military advantage in a likely scenario where these two countries might meet over a Taiwan contingency or something else in the Pacific, that's real hard-nosed competitive stuff. Um, but if it's just a vague sense that, my nation ought to lead in technology, to me, that's more sloganeering than analytically, reality-based thinking. So it can be rousing and it could be a good way to mobilize people for something, but we should think of that, and I think we should encourage students to think of it as an idea that is being used for something rather than an idea that represents what's actually happening.
I think it's a really good advice to be specific here. And I also think that because AI touches on so many different things, there are aspects of it that are inherently competitive. For example, if we're talking about the commercial use of it,
Mhm.
every AI company wants to be the best. They want to be the one with the most sales, with the most users, and reaches the most geographical markets. And they're always going to be do that because there is market incentives to be the number one. They want to be the Google of the AI era, to dominate this technology. So in that sense, yes, there will always be competition, and because these companies eventually have a headquarter in some one country or another, people look at it to see that as a standing for, okay, this country is going to win in a commercial race of AI. But then there are a lot of other aspects of AI that doesn't really need to be competitive. Like, for example, when it comes to academic, it's not really like each individual researcher is trying to be the best in the field, right? They're always collaborating with other researchers across borders, across fields, and they're trying to push the research forward. Or in the governance field, it also doesn't have to be a race too. Are we seeing the US and Chinese government racing on who can regulate AI more, like who can give the AI companies a harder time? We're not seeing that, and there's not going to be a race there. But just in this very politicized narrative of US versus China, we're seeing kind of a lot of the more interesting dynamics within the AI industry being reduced to this like US versus China race framework. And if the discussion we're having, for example, like the academic part of it or the governance part of it, does not fit into that framework, a lot of times just not published, it's not being talked about, it's not being said by the government, and it's just like being set behind. Yeah. Set aside.
And thank you both for that. It would appear that this using race, a contest, as a framework, it certainly has advantage if you're the one discussing it, you're looking to get readers, you want an editor to publish your story and not something else. Uh, it definitely has that kind of appeal. And so some people would say this falls into the category of some political reporting, which misses the substance for the horse race aspect, that who's ahead, who's behind, without talking about why that matters and getting specific, as Zoe just did, about these various realms, commercial, and also, as Graham highlighted, military, a military application, something like that. Without getting specific, having some sort of generic statement about leadership or lagging behind is, it seems, more of a mobilization tool than anything else, trying to rally people or trying to scare people. So I think that this is really important. And Graham's suggestion of let's have a little bit of humility about all of this because the future is, of course, unknowable. And exactly where all of these things matter and when they're going to matter uh, most is not something that we're so certain about. Tsui and others has mentioned kind of government involvement. And one reason this comes up is because, as Graham highlighted, attempts to restrict access to microchips and things like that in this. And as Tsui highlighted, some differences between what he's observed in terms of Chinese and American approaches to AI. Could we take a moment and talk about the government? Both, and when we say the government, we're talking about governments in both places and governments at multiple levels. And let's begin perhaps with the role of a government in terms of encouraging the development of this technology. And we can highlight several different things, but certainly the question of talent, the question of access to data and whether or not and legal use of data in various forms, enforcement of intellectual property rights, and other considerations. And so perhaps this time we'll start with Tsui and say something here about the relative roles of the two governments. And Graham highlighted a policy document in China in 2017. More people are probably familiar with this plan that came out in 2015 called Made in China 2025, and it had AI, autonomous vehicles, a whole host of things where China sought to make gains, to make absolute gains in China's own capacity, but also gains relative to the rest of the world. Please, so go ahead and get us started.
Yeah, I think Graham will probably talk more about kind of like how China is like focusing its resources, Chinese government is focusing the resources into developing AI sector. I want to highlight a different things, which is that Chinese government has really become or emerged as the unlikely leader of AI safety governance in the world, which is not that surprising if you think of it, right? Like we talk about how China has been pretty successful at nailing Jello to the wall, at controlling the internet. And as internet evolves to the next phase, which is that a lot of interactions are now done through AI, the Chinese government is also very equipped at figuring out how do we regulate AI so it doesn't have kind of a safety risk, it doesn't disrupt the societal stability in China, or it doesn't touch on the subjects the Chinese government wants to censor.
I'm sorry, so if I could just interrupt for a second, and if you could clarify what you mean by safety. So safe for the party state, also safe for users, or safe for the larger society. Now you just highlighted maintenance of stability as one aspect.
Yeah, because it's really about all of that. If you go to like a policy document from China talking about how it wants, like the guardrail it wants to set for an AI model, I would say 50% or even like 70% of that would seem very common sense to someone in the United States. You were talking about the AI should not harm individual, like should not kind of like harm the minors, and it should not collect too much privacy data about each users. Like all of these are things I would say everyone in the world could agree with. But at the same time, there are always some aspects in there too, some like just provisions they will be talking about the AI should be adhering to like the socialist values in China. It should help to like promote harmony in the Chinese society, which is really an umbrella term for a lot of things, like the moral values that the Chinese government wants to uphold. So all of that combined, we're seeing the Chinese government kind of like combine those two kind of directions into one push at giving more guardrails to the AI companies, like giving them a smaller space to operate in and trying to dictate where AI models go from now. And again, that's going to give us some good inspirations on how to regulate AI, because some of those kind of like common sense values that the Chinese government is trying to pursue will help inspire like politicians and lawmakers around the world into, okay, if we're trying to hold accountable a powerful AI system or a powerful AI company not even your border, what can we do? What legal tools do we have? At the same time, there is also the risk of like setting a precedent for authoritarian governments around the world to be like, if our goal is to rein AI for our own purposes, this is also a playbook for us to directly learn from, because China is just very proactive at doing that. Although one thing I will say is that when we are talking about kind of like who's drafting like the policy documents in China, a lot of time it still takes a lot of input from the academics, from the industry, like from people who are not just the Chinese government, like in trying to put in common sense, like reasonable regulation into the government's ears. So I will say that it's not that the Chinese government is just like dictating completely like how the industry goes. There is some civil society participation, but at the end of the day, the government does have a very tight grip onto this, and they are trying to push for more efforts to regulate AI.
Thank you. Graham?
I think Zoe's covered that pretty well. So if we just want to move into another question, in the interest of time, I'm glad to do that, unless you want me to go in a particular direction there.
No, well, this was useful. Several people have asked about various aspects of a government role in terms of regulation, and so Zoe's just covered some of this. My original question was about how governments nourish, and one of the things that Zoe referred to was, this competition for talent. And one question that I would have, because we've heard about large sums of money that Meta, Mark Zuckerberg's dominated company, has provided to try and bring in researchers, and we've heard about very lucrative arrangements for researchers. But maybe we could say something more about the role of talent in creating this, because again, what we're talking about are creating these models and applications that don't answer the questions themselves, but find these answers and develop these answers and come up with and process this information and address it. What talents do these folks have? What makes them so critical?
Yeah, well, there's it kind of, I think the implied focus of your question is what people consider today frontier AI, which is a contentious term on its own, as opposed to the many, many applications of what could be considered more commonplace machine learning. Of course, the stuff that was frontier 5 years ago is now commonplace. So there's for economic and other applications of essentially the math that is embodied in AI techniques, and then the sort of, an AI model is a combination of the math that creates it, the training data that goes into it, and you can think of it as embodying a bunch of energy and other sort of infrastructure that allowed it to be created. And then it's sort of, the cake has been baked. The ingredients are all together, and it can be sort of, because it's a digital object, it can be copied and repurposed in various ways. So there's a lot of skills involved in how to use the various copies of the cake that go around. And that's one type of talent that is a lot more like, good old-fashioned software engineering and product building. So there, if a government wanted to promote the development of that kind of talent, there's some education involved. Like, you want people to get computer science degrees and engineering experience, but a lot of it is, people learn on the job and get good at that stuff. And the Chinese case, there is a concerted effort to develop a bunch of AI schools, and of course, to encourage more and more people to be trained in STEM disciplines. In the U.S., we talk about that sometimes, but it's much more laissez-faire. And of course, at the present moment, the U.S. government seems to be full on attacking that strength in the United States, especially as to the real fuel for U.S. talent pool, which is the fact that some of the very best from all over the world like to show up to places like Stanford and many other schools in the United States. So uh, that said, there is this sort of rarefied small talent. If you're concerned about the so-called frontier, and if it turns out that the increasingly advanced large language models of this kind are the thing that's going to make a big difference, then there really are a relatively small number of people who are experienced in tweaking the math and the recipes and figuring out how to uh, squeeze more utility out of this insight, out of the particular algorithmic insight that's called a transformer that's behind the LLM. That's a smaller group of people. There just aren't as many people who are experienced in that way. Um, a heck of a lot of them are American. A heck of a lot of them are Chinese. A lot of the Chinese ones are working in the United States, but it's a very international but relatively small group. And so those people right now, because the market suspects uh, this could be the key to trillions and trillions of dollars, those people are able to uh, command enormous, just mind-blowing compensation packages. For now, this could all fall apart pretty soon if there's a sense of plateau on the profitability of LLMs and if the so-called AI bubble, which may or may not exist, if it breaks. I don't know. I think a lot of these people will find that the next contract renewal will not be as lucrative.
Yeah, we'll come back to the question of an AI bubble and the financing and things like that. But say, would you like to weigh in on this in terms of uh, it? What is the attraction of AI doing to the rest of the tech world? Is the greatest talents drifting in this way? What is being neglected as a consequence of this? What's happening?
I actually want to say that in China, maybe because there is just less of a focus on AGI, so less of like
Mhm.
companies just like pouring resources into one very specific direction. I am still seeing a lot of like the other applications of like artificial intelligence or machine learning, or the kind of like the more traditional consumer tech fields that we know about. So in a way, I feel like the concentration of resources is less of a case in China, and that's a good thing because we don't want every resource to go into this
Mhm.
one specific bubble, right? We want people to still be working in other tech sectors, and we are seeing that in China because China is very good at manufacturing, it's very good at hardware. So there are a lot of other aspects of tech that are also receiving a lot of like government support and also like commercial interest too. So in that way, I think it's probably a little bit more healthy there over there.
Yeah, well, and obviously, automation continues to roar ahead, and there's an artificial intelligence component of that. Artificial intelligence connected to the design of these things. So there's a lot of overlap. Now, you just touched on one thing that came through in your presentation that I wanted to come back to, and that was where you highlighted maybe the focus on these applications, these particular apps. And you also gave us some indication of the relative market share, as it were, in terms of users. ByteDance with its three flavors and how it stands compared to these others. And what does that say? Is this reflecting uh, greater attention to applicability to commercial and getting to a commercial use faster, finding a profit rather than let's see if we can, Graham, I've forgotten the expression, a durable lead. Can we just simply get so far out ahead that we will determine what happens? What's going on, Zoe?
I think one thing is that it goes uh yeah, like I think you're right that like these Chinese companies are probably a little bit more realistic. They're like, we need to make some money. We can't just like focus on this endless pursuit of AI model capability improvement forever. We need to figure out how to make money fast. And that really pushes them to try to combat buying that with a lot of the parts of our lives today. Some of those will be scams. Like they're gonna try to put AI in places where it's not supposed to be in. But some of them could actually change how our life works. So in that sense, I am just very clearly observing what is going to come out of China because there are more companies and researchers there focusing on if we can put AI into different things. And I think that I would like to see more kind of interesting applications of that. The other thing I think it highlights is that when we're talking about how humans interact with AI, we're not just talking about kind of like white collar educated people who are very well versed with conversing with a computer, with a chatbot. We are talking a lot of people who are probably not very tech savvy or not even know how to type like into a chatbot. So how do you make AI accessible to them and also appealing to them? I think that is something actually I see Chinese AI companies put more research and resources into because they are catering to a very large part of Chinese people who are not very well educated. So these are another area that I feel like most of the researchers and companies in the US probably ignore just because like this when they're working with the US audience, it's a very different demographics. But yeah, I think that also gives us like other possibilities that what AI will look like in the future.
Thank you. And Graham, maybe you could say something about these different approaches.
Yeah, well, what I think is what I'll offer is a sort of a hypothetical, something that I've been thinking about. There's an assumption embedded in the U.S. policy of keeping chips away from China that scale of compute, adding more computation and more chips, is going to be the key to a massive advantage. That's the bet. If it turns out that scale isn't the thing that wins whatever the competition is in this period of time, then U.S. companies are investing massive amounts and the returns might not be there, whereas Chinese companies are simply not able to because they can't buy as many of those ultra expensive chips. And meanwhile, they're putting their considerable talents to trying to figure out how to eke a little bit of revenue out of different applications of all this stuff. And you can really see an explosion of applications over the last year since DeepSeek emerged. And that's going to, they're earlier in that than the US is, which has had kind of ChatGPT to work with since 2022. So we might be in a situation where if scale isn't the answer, the Americans have just blown a lot of money, and the Chinese have built some pretty interesting business models. But whether this is, ultimately, like this is a business logic I'm talking about. I would hope that we would look to what's actually good for people, and that's a much deeper question that I don't think we probably have time to get into.
We don't have time to do it justice, but we definitely have a moment here, and I would like to ask for both of you to reflect on the promise of AI and give us, your take on what portion of that promise have we realized in terms of bettering, civilization. And you can define that however you want. Better healthcare, better, better tutoring, labor saving in various ways. However you choose to define it. How are we doing about the promise of AI? And either of you can go. I can see you're both so anxious to jump on this.
I can start. I am genuinely interested in how AI will change kind of cross-language communication in the future, because as someone who's really just very interested in learning more about all the other cultures and countries and markets, I feel like it has never been as easy as now. And I think large language models are good at language, so this is something that they should help us with. And I'm just looking forward for kind of like people from different language backgrounds to be using this technology, using it with their own kind of like data and training and use cases to figure out maybe there's things outside of English language and Chinese language world that the AI models can really be good at.
Yeah, that's certainly one of my hopes is that it will facilitate greater communication. and greater understanding in the sense of knowing what the other side thinks. I saw recently, quite by accident, an application of AI in this space. One of the video bloggers that I routinely watch, he travels around China, and he's he speaks, and there's always Chinese subtitles for it. But in the most recent application, Google decided he would speak English. He doesn't speak English, but they had this automatic dubbing. And that's possible because, of course, they're just taking the subtitles and rendering it into English. And it's not something that I set. It's just something that Google said, well, you watch, things in English, maybe you'd like to watch this. So again, I don't know if it's a good thing. You can experiment on your own with YouTube. Graham, what do you think about the promise?
I think that there's a lot of unrealized implications of AI, and some will be good and some will be bad. I think we're quite early in that unfolding. I'm hopeful that scientists will be able to use some techniques, not necessarily even large language models, but various types of machine learning to really make progress in medical sciences. Mm-hmm. I think talking about curing cancer is a little bit overselling it at the moment, but pharmaceuticals are gonna get better. People are really making progress with this stuff. There's a lot of scientific stuff. I'm less optimistic about the cultural. I think the bigger question is, can we figure out how to navigate with this existing without tearing ourselves apart before we come to some social and international peace with it.
Well, we had both the hopeful note and this ominous note. And in our poll, that's where most of the people attending this webinar are. They hope for one, but they're also concerned about others. We certainly know that AI has the power, that certain actors have the ability to use AI to flood discussion forums and all sorts of other spaces with ideas that might be, incorrect and not factual and divisive. So that's one possibility, and that's that is a hazard. But perhaps AI can save lives. Perhaps it can help us talk to each other a bit more. Thanks to everybody. Sandra, I'm going to turn things back to you. Sorry that we're beyond the appointed hour.
Thank you, Graham, Zia, and Clay. We certainly can spend a few more hours on this topic. I hope this webinar gives you a new perspective of this new challenge in the U.S. China relationship. Please stay connected with us as we bring more topical issues into focus on U.S. China and Asian American topics. If you're interested in more programs like this, please find us at 1990institute.org, donate, and follow us on social media and YouTube channels. Please do not forget to also subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you, and have a good evening.